maybe you're just coming into this Zoom sort of not knowing anything, which is a nice way to be too. But we author founded in the sense that there was a bunch of writers that got together a few years ago in Colorado, actually, and they were global writers. You know, Colin McCann, who's our co-chair, is an Irish writer, actually lives in New York City. And we have people like Ishmael Beyer, who's from Sierra Leone, who's an author. His new book just came out, actually. I think it's called Little Families, Felice, or Small Families.
A little family,
yeah. And a bunch of others. There were poets and a sort of host of other artists, musicians, and they got together and they were sort of tricked into this notion of a story exchange, which is where people come together and exchange a story from their lives. And then you have to listen to the person's story deeply, and then you tell them your story or any story from your life. And then you actually come back into a space like this. Well, originally it was in a physical space. Now we're in a virtual space, and you have to tell your partner's story back in the first person. So that's the essential premise or the method of what we do. Now, I wish we could do that with you today, but we don't have the time. Unfortunately, we're limited by the time. It takes about 2 hours, about an hour, well, 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how the sort of age range of the audience. But we are going to give you a little precursor to the story exchange by having you connect deeply through stories, through conversation in a minute. So, and we found that was the quickest route that stories are the quickest route to creating empathy between folk. And I think it's an extremely important moment historically that people are trying to really, I mean, the idea of social isolation has sort of disrupted this narrative, right? That we're so used to, this need for human connection. And so we've turned our whole world virtual overnight, and we've been doing virtual exchanges. And what's been really sort of uplifting and eye-opening is that the whole globe is getting involved in these. That sort of all of these borders that we once had that limited us for many reasons, that couldn't. Now those borders have been lifted, and for the most part, people are tuning in from all over the world. There's a deep need to tell your story. And a lot of them are anchored in this moment, sort of these pandemic stories. Where are you finding meaning or joy, or what is this new reality like for you? So I'll stop there just for a second because I want to hand the mic to Felice for a second, but that's a little about what we do.
So I think what's really unique about this moment that the entire globe is affected. I think there are moments when things happen like a disease and it happens over there, but in our current reality, we're all in a boat together, right? Our experience of that ride may be very different, but there is a shared experience happening and a shared suffering happening. And so I also think that's an opportunity for a deeper level of sharing for humanity in general. I just posted a quote in the chat that one of our facilitators had shared on Twitter, and it's something that really resonated with me as truth, which is another thing I find myself seeking during these times, right? There's so much information and misinformation. Like, I just want to hear things that are true. And so this is from a professor at Morgan State University. He wrote, "If you think your students are going to look back on spring 2020 and remember your Zoom lectures, you're fooling yourself. They will remember how you handled the transition. They will remember your compassion. They will remember moments of healing." And that quote actually reminds me of, I think it was a Maya Angelou quote where she says, people won't remember what you did, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And as an organization anchored in feeling, I think we have an opportunity as educators to have students have, our communities have a positive experience around their feelings right now in the midst of chaos. So I'll hand it back to you, Lee.
Thank you, Felice. And I promise in about 5 minutes, we're going to not talk at you. We're going to actually put you into little rooms and you're going to start having some of these conversations yourself. But the quote that Felice put in the chat box is quite apropos to how I got involved with this work, which is about 7.5 years ago. I was an English teacher in Newtown in Connecticut, in Sandy Hook. And obviously most of you are coming from an educational background and you know what happened in our town, it's probably one of the signature horrors, you know, at least in the last sort of 10 years, where we had a mass shooting in our school system. I taught in the high school, which is next door, just down the street, actually, from the elementary school, and 26 people were killed in under 10 minutes. And so to think about how do you pivot, you know, during in education, how do you work with students? That quote rings true, because nothing was the same for us in our community. We certainly weren't going to go into school the next day. Actually, we were out of school for about 3 weeks, but we weren't going to go back to school and have business as normal, due to the trauma of the entire town. So we had to think about moments of compassion and caring that we could help with the healing, with students, with ourselves as a community. So it was really sort of by default that I got into this empathy work, because at the same time the authors were meeting in Colorado, the authors that founded this organization, they were tackling this question about how can we use stories as currency, or our stories as on the ground, and use them in a way that fosters such a deep, meaningful connection between people that it can be tangible and instill hope. And this was sort of what they were tackling. What was the highest aim of storytelling? I got to meet Colin McCann just after the Newtown sort of tragedy, and when we met, he had told me about this sort of brainchild, this idea that he had, and I brought it to Newtown. I brought this idea, and the idea of my students telling stories that weren't anchored in a single narrative was very important during this time period, because there were many narratives, and yet this one, we don't have the luxury of that single narrative being attached to our town, which was the murders in our town. So I brought it into my classroom. I was teaching juniors at the time in a high school, English teacher, and I had them do a story exchange. And I thought a lot of the stories would be anchored in 1214 on that day, and many of the stories were, but I would say the majority of them were not. And it sort of disrupted this narrative, and they were telling stories of, first loves, pets. They were telling stories about crazy uncles or grandparents, and there was a lot of laughter in the room in a time when we weren't really smiling much. So it became this incredible moment in the classroom where I realized this need, this urge to tell your story meant something. And then what we did is we twinned them with a school in Chicago, in Southside Chicago. A friend of mine who works in a very tough school where they deal with gun violence on a daily basis, he brought a bunch of students, and most of the kids in the Chicago school were African American or Hispanic, and different socioeconomic class. So there was a lot of different identifiers, and my school was predominantly sort of white, middle class, sort of, squirrels and yellow school buses all over the place. And we brought these kids together, and then what happened was, in this story exchange, all of these preconceived biases they might have had with one another came tumbling down. So we kind of shattered any stereotypes that we're having, or they were shattering them themselves. And they became fast friends. And they're still friends to this day, a lot of the students. And so it was kind of a mistake, in a sense, that this whole thing came about, or at least this intentional empathy that we created. And it all boiled down to the story. And if you collapse the distance between people pretty quickly and tell a story, then there's a lot of transformation that can come from that. Now, I will hand it over to Felice, who's going to talk a little bit about empathy, because it is a buzzword right now and it's all over the place. Felice.
What I love about what you just said, Lee, was sort of giving people an opportunity, whatever space they're in, to tell their own story. I think no matter who you are, you've had a story told about you that may or may not be true. And so when you get to choose the story that you want to tell, I think there's a lot of power in that. So yes, we talk about empathy at Narrative4. We talk about promoting empathy, celebrating empathy. So my question to you as a group is, what is empathy and why is it important? So I'm going to ask you to put your thoughts in the chat. You don't have to Google dictionary definition, just sort of whatever comes to mind. What is empathy and why is it important? And David, I would love to show our PowerPoint. Can I pull that up, or can you? All right, so I'm looking in the chat. I see understanding what another person is going through, listening or observing, putting yourself in one another's shoes, active listening, thinking about the other person's perspective. I mean, we have an A+ group here. I think you guys have touched on most, if not all, of the key components of empathy. So the slide that I have on the screen now, we'd like to think about empathy in terms of these 4 components. So seeing another person's world, understanding their feelings, which doesn't mean feeling what they feel, but just having an understanding of what they're going through, being able to communicate that understanding back to them or to another person, and then appreciating them as human beings without judgment. So the importance of empathy. I'm just going to bring up all of the bullets. So when we talk about the value of empathy, these are some of the bullet points that we're thinking about. The ability to build connection and trust with another person, allowing us to respond appropriately to others, hopefully taking a compassionate and helping action. At Narrative4, you'll hear us talk a lot about empathy into action. So once you've experienced the story exchange and you have this increased sense of empathy, you often want to do something, right? And I started working with Narrative4 when I was at the Brooklyn Public Library. I was working with adult learners who are learning how to read and write. And we did a story exchange, and then we ended up creating a play based on the students' writing to sort of share those voices with a larger public. But that was my personal desire before even working with Narrative4 as an employee to want to turn that empathy into some kind of action. Empathy also allows us to imagine the world from multiple viewpoints, makes us better able to resolve conflict. In an ideal world, it will foster more productive dialogue, and it's also helpful in convincing and motivating others to see each other more clearly. So I think it's important to talk about what empathy is not. Empathy is not pity, feeling sorry for someone. It's not sympathy. You do not have to like someone to be empathetic for them or empathetic with them. And it's not at all a substitute for living someone's actual experience, right? So feeling for a person does not mean that you know everything that they've been through or that you know their actual lived experience. I also think Lee likes to say empathy is raggedy, which I love. We think about empathy as something positive, but it requires vulnerability, which can sometimes make you feel unsafe or uncertain, right? Uncomfortable. But that's part of the risk of empathy, braving that discomfort to come out on the other side. And it can also elicit strong emotions. We're going to move into our deep conversation guide, but one of the things I just want to say is that this isn't about digging into your deepest, darkest trauma, right? This is really about connecting on a human level. So you get to decide how deep you want to go, how far you want to go in your conversations, but please take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lee.
Thank you, Felice. Feel free to type in any questions that you have as we go through. Maybe hit the next slide for me as well, Felice. One of the things that we think is one of the most democratic things to do is just tell a story. It's something that everybody has hundreds of. It's something that you can do around a campfire or on Zoom. And it's fun. It can be a lot of fun, but there are also some bigger reasons why you want to tell stories. And I'm just curious what you think. And actually you can unmute yourselves too, if you want. I would like to hear your voices too. Why stories? Why does that seem to be the currency that creates empathy? Curious to hear what you think.
I think it's about voice. You hear someone's voice, yes. You hear their rhythms, you hear their pauses, you hear their emotions.
Thank you.
I think reciprocity, because as you're telling, someone's listening, and you might tell it differently to a different person. So there's a reciprocal relationship that feeds both the teller and the listener.
think stories are personal, and it's not like academic or removed. It creates that human collection, and it's also like, or connection, and it's a low barrier of entry.
Authenticity. People know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, these are all brilliant answers. You should just come around with us all the time, and we'll just throw you on stage when we're doing some work. Yeah, I mean, the stories, it's very quick. We think that one of the artists we work with in Minnesota, she said after a story exchange that the distance between two people is a story, because it's a starting point, and it's something that you can't dismiss. Somebody was talking about authenticity, and it's real, and there's a truth in stories. If you're telling them, right, yourself, yes, we can get into philosophical discussions about that, but it is a way to, you can't dismiss somebody once they tell a story from the heart. It's very hard to just dismiss them or see them as an ideology or a caricature. If you meet them, there's a sort of common ground that can be met, because it's the emotional plane. And I could talk about stories, you know, the universality of stories, that, you know, we share values through stories. It's a real window into worlds, and they're a lot of fun. So that's our currency at Narrative4. But then we flip the script a little by making you take on somebody's story, and you actually have to tell it back in the first person, which is a very visceral thing. And you're more than welcome to join one of our virtual story exchanges. We have them every week. I can post something in the chat in a few, where you can sign up for those, and you can actually go through the real story exchange. But sometimes it's not as simple as just bringing people to a space and having them tell a story. There's a lot of anxiety around that. There's a lot of power in a room. There's a lot of privilege. There's a lot of identifiers. There's a lot of things that you have to do well to facilitate that space, that emotional space. And just assuming that people are going to come and tell a story is another assumption that sometimes is problematic. So what we wanted to do today was sort of pair you up, and we're going to throw a guide that we have, this deep conversation guide. It's a simple guide to deep connection. There it is. Thank you. And what we're going to ask you to do for about 20 minutes is go into a breakout space. And we use this before people actually do their story exchanges. A lot of the times with students, we'll use this, and you can actually take this and try it out. And this actually you can do with your family, your friends, your students. It's not just, you know, you don't have to sort of shoehorn it into one sort of particular space. And for example, I know that after the election sort of 3.5 years ago, a lot of people were having trouble having conversations with their own family who had different views from them. Well, maybe this simple guide is something that you can do, because it's a starting place. And the beauty of this guide is that it's designed to get people to sort of get to know each other on a very surface level at first. And the further you go through the guide, depending on how brave or courageous you want to be, you can get to the sort of more deeper conversations that you would like to have with people. So the guide, did we put the guide, Felice, in the little chat box? We can put it in there and people can.
Yep, there's a link in the chat. If you click on that, it will bring up the full PDF with all the questions.
All right, cool. And it starts with the basics, right? And it's a step-by-step sort of progress. You can look at the types of questions, and you're actually going to move through some of these questions and just ask each other these things, and you're going to sort of have a conversation, and then we're going to come back and we're going to sort of brainstorm what that felt like, what it was like to do this. And the questions can be as sort of surface level as, you know, if you could have either, I don't know, somebody to cook your meals the rest of your life, or clean your house or your apartment the rest of your life, what would you choose? I don't know. You take that one and talk about that. You can, and then it moves on. It's sort of what music are you loving right now, things that we share in common, right? And then the further you go down, the deeper the questions get, right? And I'm not going to spoil it by talking anymore, but you can take a look at the guide. We're going to throw you in a room for about 20 minutes, and you're going to walk through this and ask each other questions. There are a couple of, you know, so some of the community norms that we have. I think it's on the slide, right, Felice? Yeah. This is just a little precursor before you do this, right? We want to honor privacy, so the stories that you hear or the conversations that you have stay in those breakout rooms. The stories stay, the lessons can leave, right? So you have permission to sort of talk about the lessons that you glean from that, but not the actual conversation, unless your partner gives you permission. Be fully present. Please be present. You know, unless you're on your phone for this Zoom, you can put away your phones. Try not to be answering emails. I noticed David had about 4,000 emails in his inbox because I saw it when he was sharing his screen. David, you better get to that. Please speak from the I perspective. All right, no general statements. I challenge yourself. You know, courage takes many forms. Courage is about, and brave space is about, withholding too. So that you're in charge of what you want to say today. We're not forcing you to say anything you don't want to. Keep it dialogue, which is not what I'm doing right now. This is very much monologue. Keep it dialogue between the two of you, and just be real and have fun and embrace the raggedy. All right, you don't have to be perfect. Turn that inner critic off. Any questions about what we're going to ask you to do, or what we're asking you to do?
Lee, when we put people into the breakout rooms, they'll be either with one other person or perhaps have 3 in the room.
That's fine.
And the amount of time that we have again is about 15 to 17 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, can we come back and have 5 minutes together, right? Just to debrief?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And then do you want them to use the guide, or is there any other directions?
I would prefer that you use the guide. Yeah, just to get a sense of it. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I
mean,
once
that's
again,
what it's for. Yeah.
And I would, because we have a limited amount of time, I would encourage you to start in one section and then move to another section, just to see how asking different types of questions informs the type of conversation that you have. Welcome back, everyone.
Yes.
Do we all still love each other?
Oh my God, even more. Got a new best
Can we give
friend.
ourselves a hug?
Me too. Patty and I were teamed up together. You guys picked perfect people to. She just was so great. I just
Good matchmaking.
already.
Hey, this is random. There's nothing prescribed about this. We just randomized whatever. In fact, David did it. We didn't even have anything to do with it. So I'm just curious.
Lee, speak for yourself. That was intentional. I knew that Patty and Susan would be phenomenal together.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
To play God over there in the corner, right? I'm curious. Obviously, you know, this is not the story exchange, but this is the precursor to the story exchange. We do this stuff all the time with kids, with adults, especially when we bring groups that never usually get a chance to meet each other. We start very simple with these guides, and we just let them have ownership over the questions they want to ask each other, or even refrain from answering. You don't have to answer the questions. You can pass, right? So I'm just curious how it was for you, how the experience was for you. So you can you can let fly. I'm just curious. I'm an English teacher, my hang time is excellent. I can wait all day until it gets so awkward.
I was just trying not to overtalk. I'm trying to be polite.
I can say something. I thought it was an interesting experience. I noticed that even if we started with something that was relatively light, the way the conversation goes, you can very easily get into deep territory without even realizing it. Like one of them was like, what music do you like listening to? And then I ended up talking about how my parents didn't want me to speak their language because they were afraid it would affect my English acquisition. So, you know, it was, I guess just the way people connect is, it can get very real very fast, even when you're trying to keep it safe. Because that's just always with us. So whoever we are is always like right at the surface, ready for us to explore.
When Lisa and we were realizing that with every question, there were so many different directions we could go in to answer, and that we were, each of us individually, having to make a choice about which story pathway we took, and that would then have an impact, you know, not only in the story we told, but also on the perceptions that she would have of me, because it would tell one slice of me, when there are so many other layers that I could have chosen.
Mm.
Well, Susan and I got the heart of who we are very quickly because she asked about my backdrop. I asked about hers. We're both passionate about thrift shopping and aesthetics. So we could go on forever. And Nathan, it didn't get super deep, but it went to our values of, you know, how we entertain ourselves, what matters to us, how important it is visually. But we just went from here, didn't look at the book, didn't shut up.
Hey, that's perfect. That's great. You didn't need much of a nudge.
No. Can I also say that it was like meeting a friend for the first time, but just really feeling an instant connection, and that it didn't need to go deep to make that connection. It just was there.
Sure.
I always love the fact that it's like, even though we have all these different backgrounds and diverse experiences, there's still a thread that connects us. Like, we just kind of started talking about different things and issues that had come up in education and stuff like that. And it was really cool because we had someone from New York, someone from LA, and I'm right here in the middle. So it's like, it's cool, even though the things we were talking about were sad that they are an issue. It's interesting to talk about that common thread.
Sure. Yeah. And that actually still works when you're bringing people. I mean, most people here, it's a fairly like-minded audience, I would imagine, because of the educational background. So let's not kid ourselves that we're not sort of, we're all here because we want to be here. But what happens if you don't want to be here, or you're in a space where it's not volunteering? And, you know, so you have to be pretty, in tune with the identities that are in a room and why people are actually there as well. So some of these questions are perfect for that, because some people just want to stay in the first question, the surface level, and they're not ready. They don't feel safe enough to move on, you know. But that's where you meet people at least in our work. That's where we have to meet people where they're at, you know. I'm just curious about it. Did anyone actually get through a number of the questions, or did you just get? Yeah.
Yeah, Sonnet and I, we did questions from getting feet wet. This is fun. Tell me more. We did not end up in the deep end, but I think we went in our own kind of mind way to that deep end. You know, kind of looking into the questions and the ways we were responding. So it was kind of like we went into the meta deep end, but
That's allowed.
I also think it was sort of interesting because we're telling stories and using words, but the visual aspect of this interface of the question about, like, we use objects a lot. So we went to the stuff conversation, not unlike what, you know, Patty was just describing that they did, sort of what's in our background, what's in our, and how rich the story of a particular thing is, even though it's not particularly evident.
Yeah, objects are very powerful. You know, we do object exchanges all the time. When we bring people together, they have to bring an object of significance and just trade their stories about it. So, David, I'm curious how much time we have left in the session. I don't want to.
We have about 3 more minutes left, Lee and stuff. So if you want to do some final things, you and Felice,
Sure.
And then we want to make sure that there's just a little bit of time. I'll give people some directions of next things that are coming up as well,
Right.
along with reflection. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so obviously if you have questions, you can type them in to the chat box, but just in sort of brief closing, we're an organization that really has had a very quick trajectory in 7.5 years. And that's not because we're sort of professionally or excellent, or we have this thing like, I mean, it's stories. And I'm sure that our method, you know, the story exchange itself you could have a through line back to theater, right? It's about taking on somebody else and character and saying it back. But there's something that's very visceral that happens when you converse with somebody, and there's all these neuroscience studies done on eye contact and what happens in the brain. And I'm not going to bore you with that now, but there's a lot of hard science to back this up too. we are in hundreds and hundreds of schools around the globe, and we bring people together to build curriculum together, teachers. But it all starts with a conversation. Everything starts with a conversation or a story. And that's our collateral, and it's the quickest way to build community. And especially, I heard the word intention used in Lisa's workshop a lot, about how we intentionally create a space for people to feel heard, feel validated. And this is one way that you could do this with your students, and hopefully you'll do it, or your family members, your own children. And you'll be amazed at what happens when you build. It builds community very fast, even though there's a distance between us. So on our website, and maybe Felice, I don't know if you put it in the chat box, but maybe that we have a feed that we can send, which invites people to live events that we do. And I implore you, I would love to see you at one of the virtual story exchanges we do. And that's actually where you never know who's showing up from around the world. It's about a 2-hour commitment, just under 2 hours. I know people have Zoom gloom right now, and there's all studies on that, but it is a very cool 2-hour experience to actually go through a story exchange. And then if you're interested, we have a complete facilitation sort of training that actually we're offering it for free right now. I think until the end of May, I'm not sure. And that actually talks about how do you sort of facilitate these spaces when you have to think about the audiences that are coming to these spaces. So it's really facilitation. We do that every day as teachers, but also it transcends teaching as well. So I would love to see you to come to one of those, and then you'll really get a sense of the work that we do. And we work around a lot of themes, but 5 of our big themes is violence, immigration, identity, the environment, and faith. So we bring people together very intentionally around some of these sort of complicated, sometimes contentious themes, and we build community really fast. So I'm going to be quiet now.
I just want to add one thing before we go. In our group, Sarah was talking about history and students saying sometimes they don't like history, and her response is often, well, you just haven't found the history that resonates with you, that's yours to enjoy and experience. And I think the beautiful thing about stories is that everyone has one. Everyone has multiple stories, right? So it's not just about Abraham Lincoln, right? It's about you in this moment and what you're doing and how that is affecting the future and what's to come. And I think that's something I would love to impart to students everywhere, just sort of that they matter, their stories matter, and that the world needs them, right?
Yeah, and the stories make you more willing to act compassionately, right? For somebody else that perhaps you've never even thought about that much, or you've characterized them in some other way. It sort of dismantles some of those structures when you get to know a personal story. So so thanks for giving us a little window.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. And it was nice meeting you all. And hopefully you'll sign up for these events.